We really appreciate you coming out. We've got a great presentation, and we're glad y'all are here. My name is Lang Hornthal. I'm the co-executive director of EcoForesters. We are a local nonprofit here in Asheville whose mission is the restoration and conservation of forests. A little housekeeping first. If you need the bathroom, right in the back of the room, just off to the left, you'll see the men's and women's room. Please feel free to mill around, get a beer, have some food, stretch. The way things are going to go tonight, we have a great presentation that's going to last about 15 or 20 minutes. That's going to kind of set the stage for our discussion. And then we're going to have a panel discussion. There's going to be an opportunity for questions from the audience. We'll have a phone number up here that you'll be able to text your questions in. And we're excited just about a great conversation tonight. It's fitting that today is International Forest Day. And the theme this year is Forest and Innovation, New Solutions for a Better World. We did not time it to be on the same day, but it feels very fortuitous because that's what we're going to be talking about a lot tonight. This forum was born as an idea of a former board member of ours. His name is Tom Ruane. There's a poster of him sitting right over here. Tom, he believed in our mission, and he always looked for new ways to get the public's attention. Tom enjoyed being behind the spotlight rather than in it, and this event is just one of many lasting examples he left with us before he left the earth last year. We really miss him, but I'd like to raise a glass to Tom Ruane and all he's done. We miss you, but his spirit and his vision, they live on. Thank you, Tom. We also wouldn't be here tonight if not for our sponsors. New Belgium has sponsored EcoForesters Forest Fund from the very beginning. Thank you, Sarah, and all your staff for making us feel welcome and supporting our mission. Kombucha and Fed Up Foods are also a sponsor. They are also believers in putting the planet first and leading through their values of lifelong learning, collaboration, and community. We are very pleased to have them as a sponsor. Lastly, Duke Energy, Jennifer, you're around here somewhere, is also a believer in the community. They are tasked with literally keeping the lights on, but they also support local nonprofits and climate resiliency. We thank these sponsors because without them, we would not be able to have this event tonight. If you are an EcoForesters staff member, please raise your hand. They're gathering in the back. That's what they always do. You got to keep an eye on them back there. We would not be able to do any of our work without our staff. They're in the forest every day getting it done. We are so thankful for y'all, and are glad y'all are here tonight. If you're an EcoForesters board member, please raise your hand. Josh and Linda and Jay, they are putting us on the correct path, managing our growth and helping us make good decisions, and we wouldn't be having the success we're having right now without their leadership. Thank y'all very much. Our work would also not be possible without the support and investment in natural resources that come from local, state, and federal governments. Drew Christie with the governor's office is here. We appreciate you coming, Drew. I think I saw John Ager here and Brian's here. That there are passionate folks in the room that are believers in investing in our natural resources. We're fortunate to have local representation that are responsive to the needs of sustainable forestry. We thank you and all y'all are doing to help make this place better. We also have some good VIPs that are going to be gathered on this stage tonight to discuss climate smart forestry and what that means for Western North Carolina. We hope to build off last year's conversation, for those of you that were here, about the closing of the Canton paper mill. It took center stage, and we learned about the trade-offs that are associated with that closing. Tonight's topic is going to consider a future where change is inevitable, and how the decisions that are made today in today's forests must consider this change that is coming. I'd like to start the evening by introducing Steve McNulty, who is going to prime our conversation by first presenting on climate smart forestry and what he has learned over his distinguished career. Steve is a USDA Forest Service Senior Research Ecologist and the director of the USDA Southeast Climate Hub located in Research Triangle Park. He has a PhD in natural resources, and he has spent over 30 years studying environmental stress impacts and adaptive management options for forests, agriculture, and rangelands. Dr. McNulty has co-authored over 300 publications on climate change impacts and ecosystem adaptation strategies with over 20,000 citations. He's the recipient of the U.S. Forest Service Distinguished Scientist Award. He has served as a U.S. Congressional Fellow. He's been the Forest Service Northern Research Station Director, the Director of the National Forest Products Laboratory, the Climate Change Chair of the North American Forestry Commission, and coordinating lead author of the Southeast Chapter for 5th National Climate Assessment. He's currently the principal investigator of the updated Silvics of North American project, and in January, he released a new book titled Future Forests through Elsevier Publishers. Please welcome Steve McNulty.
All right, good evening, everybody. So happy to see so many people here on a lovely day. I thought everybody would be outside doing something, but I'm glad you're here. So tonight what we're going to do is spend a little bit of time talking about climate-smart forestry. And this is something probably a lot of you have heard about, but maybe not quite sure what it is. And so we're going to have a panel. As Lang said, we've got some really good folks coming up here to talk. And I'm just going to kick it off with a real brief introduction into what climate-smart forestry is. So it all goes back to the beginning. And the beginning goes back to 1713 in Germany. And so climate-smart forestry is not a new concept, or at least parts of it aren't. This particular fellow we're looking at here is Karl von Karlowitz. And he was not a forester. He was an engineer, and he was into mining. And back in Europe at the time, they were doing a lot of tunneling, and he was concerned that they were going to run out of trees in which to build the mines, in which to do the shoring. And so he started this idea thinking about, well, how do we manage forests so that they're sustainable? So it was one of these, necessity is the mother of invention. Had nothing to do with anything other than needing to have those trees. We fast forward a little bit and we look at the United States. And there's 3 maps on the right side. And one on the top left is from 1820. And then the middle one is 1850. And then the bottom one is 1920. And the final one, the big one in the middle, is today. And what those maps are is a virgin forest. So originally, the eastern part of the U.S. was all virgin forest. And as we were industrializing the U.S. and building our structures, we were cutting down those trees. And for a long time, we thought they'd never end. There was enough trees forever. But we learned that wasn't the case. And by 1900 or so, this is an area of the Biltmore Forest, which some of you may be familiar with. This is this very area, where we realized that this was not an infinite resource, and we needed to manage it or we would lose it. So we started to take some of those concepts that occurred way back in the 1700s in Europe and brought them to the US. And this fine-looking fellow here is Carl Schenk, and he was America's first professional forester. A lot of the foresters originally came from Germany, and he brought that information to the United States and started the American forestry program. So one of his early disciples was a fellow by the name of Gifford Pinchot. And Gifford Pinchot was the person who would go on to start the U.S. Forest Service. So there's this legacy that happened. So way back around 1900, there was this understanding that we needed to do conservation. We needed to take the forest that was there, regrow it, improve it. A lot of it was what we call high-graded. In other words, the good trees were cut and the poor trees were left to continue to grow, which made for a very bad forest. So back in during the Depression, and this picture was taken in 1938, they started doing tree planting. And this one is in Montana, but they realized the Civil Conservation Corps, we need to start doing planting, and they started to develop this nationwide process of conservation. And around 1956, we came out with the first forestry handbook. And this was the first time in the US that all of this information was put down in a single volume that included regeneration, proper use of buildings for stream crossings, all kinds of silvicultural techniques. It was sort of the go-to information for how to manage a forest. This is a picture of my great uncle Bill Ebenthal. I come from a line of foresters and Forest Service people. Uncle Bill, great Uncle Bill, was a supervisor of the Colville National Forest back in the 1960s. He started with the Forest Service in the 30s. And I found this online, and what it says, it's a newspaper clipping, and it's from October 12th of 1963. And it says, "Conservation for a Better Tomorrow." And so it goes on to talk about how there's going to be this open meeting about how we conserve our forests and make sure that they exist. So this concept of climate smart forestry, the roots of it go way back. So what's the problem? Why do we need climate smart forestry as opposed to conservation forestry? Well, it's global warming and the associated impacts of climate change. It's been a game changer. This is just one example. I could talk for hours and hours and hours about climate change, its impacts, its what's going on in the world. This is one graph that just kind of illustrates it globally. This is a graph of the 10 hottest years on record. It's going back to 1881. These are the last 10 years. So in that total time span of almost 150 years, the hottest 10 years have been the last 10 years. And we don't call it global warming as much anymore because it's so much more than that. It's climate change, it's variability, it's extremes. And those are the sorts of things, whether it's wildfires or flooding or droughts or more intense or frequent hurricanes or ice storms where there are never ice storms or extreme cold because all the heat's going up to the Arctic areas and the cold's pushed down. This variability is changing forests, and it's changing how we need to manage forests. And just very briefly, just a couple slides, this is how it's happening. We've all heard about the greenhouse gas effect. And so carbon dioxide, methane, these are all called greenhouse gases because they trap the heat. They work like a blanket around the earth. And the more of these sort of blankets of gas, the thicker this blanket is, the more heat it traps, just like on your bed. And so what we've been doing for a very long time is putting more of this carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, trapping more heat, and the temperature is rising, and with that temperature rise, we're also having more variability in climate and other stressors. As you add heat, you have energy, right? We all know about heat equals energy and energy equals heat, that exchange. So when you add more heat, you have more energy, and things become more violent. They become more exaggerated. So this is just a graph showing from 1860 to present how that has changed. I'm going to see if I can, nope, clicker doesn't work. How that's gone. And the end, of course, is where we are now. Now that's all very problematic, but what's more problematic is not where we've been or where we are, but where we're going. So scientists have been studying this now for at least 30 years, starting really intensively in 1990 with the U.S. Global Change Research Program Act that Congress passed under the first Bush administration. But we've been putting billions of dollars into studying this, so we pretty much have a good understanding of how these interactions work. What we don't understand necessarily is what we can do about it. So given these complexities of current and forecast changes of climate and associated forest impacts, a new method for assessing climate change impacts is needed. And this is where we come to climate smart forestry. So on the right, there are three graphs, and you may not be able to read this in the back, but in the bottom we have climate smart forestry. The upper left is reduce and remove greenhouse gases, adapt forest management and forest resiliency, and sustain management supports productivity and forest-based benefits. So we do adapt for forests. We've done that for a long time. That's part of that forestry handbook and what we've been doing for decades. The Forest Service sometimes does sustainable management that supports productivity and forest-based benefits. We've been doing that for about 40 years. But what we don't do is we don't have a lot of policies that remove and reduce greenhouse gases. So when you look at it in total, there's three parts. There's adaptation, which is the thing we've done a long time. There's mitigation, which is reducing CO2 and slowing down this global warming. And the third component is a social dimension. So for a long time, we've been working on looking at how we can reduce the impacts and how we can look at it biologically. But behind all that biology are people, and people are being impacted. And not all people are being impacted equally. The poorest among us are the ones least able to adapt and to mitigate these changes. And only now are we starting to look at how these impacts affect all of, not just America, but globally. And so in combination, that's climate smart forestry. So you may hear people talking about mitigation or adaptation or a social dimension. It's all the same thing when it comes to climate smart forestry. It's just different parts of the puzzle. So the basic definition is a collection of strategies and management actions that increase the carbon storage benefit from forests and the forest sector in ways that also support ecosystem services and cultural values, and that it removes carbon emissions, increases forest resilience to climate change, and supports forest economies by increasing forest productivity and income. And the basic goal of climate smart forestry is forests and societies to transform, adapt to, mitigate climate change impacts. So that's the whole objective of this. So, as I said, we're just beginning to get into this topic now. Last fall, and I would encourage you to check this out if you're interested, Yale and the Forest Service helped put together a series on climate smart forestry. And I just put this up here because each week there would be a different seminar. And the seminars range from what is climate smart forestry to the experience of small stakeholders and climate smart forestry management and novel ecosystem change, how carbon credits influence commercial management, etc. So there's not enough time to go into all of this in 10, 15 minutes, but I would encourage you to go to the Yale website, the Forestry Forum, and you can see the videos of each one of these, and I think you'll find them very useful. All right, so the bottom line is that climate smart forestry is addressing and evolving to these non-antecedent conditions, these changes which are occurring, and that conservation forestry focuses more on a limited range of immediate environmental effects. And so what we're doing now is we're expanding the conservation forestry. I need to check my time. I normally have a little clock somewhere in the back here. I don't want to go long.
You're good.
All right, good enough. I want to give you one example of climate smart forestry, how it's applied. These are two forests, longleaf pine and loblolly pine. Longleaf pine was the dominant pine in the southeast for many, many years, for hundreds of years. It's a beautiful tree. If you've ever seen a virgin longleaf pine stand, it's breathtaking. I mean, trees this big around and just gorgeous. Most of those were cut down, as I showed in a previous graph. And they weren't replanted with longleaf, they were planted with loblolly pine. Loblolly pine has a tendency to grow more rapidly in its early stage, in the first 20, 25, 30 years. Longleaf later on grows as fast or faster than loblolly, but because of that, there's not a lot of longleaf left. But longleaf is an interesting species in that it has a lot of benefits. It's more drought tolerant, it's more fire tolerant, it's more hurricane tolerant. It's a better tree adapted to climate change and climate variability. So now we're starting to think about replanting more longleaf than historically we did. It also has a lot of wildlife benefits. So we're starting to adapt in that way. This guide on the right is a pine forest landowners guide. I thought I'd put that up there. The Climate Hub, the hub I direct, puts out guides and information on how to make your forests and your working land more resilient. This is one we put together on pine forests. So something, again, to check out if you want to find some information about that. This is just some examples of longleaf pine with the fire tendency. Longleaf pine is an interesting tree because it has what's called a bottle brush stage, For the first several years of its existence, it just kind of sits on the ground and kind of looks kind of scraggly, doesn't do much, and it sits in this bottle bunch. And all of a sudden, after 4 or 5 years, 6 years, it shoots up and it starts growing very rapidly. But you have to get it beyond that to see that growth come in. Loblolly pine doesn't do that. It grows pretty regularly from the get-go. But what longleaf does do is that if a fire comes through, and we're seeing more of these fires, that it can survive a fire much better than loblolly pine can. So if a fire comes through, the longleaf pine may survive it, the loblolly pine won't. It has a much thinner bark and is less resilient in that way. So there's some shameless plugs I want to end with here that talk more about this. Again, I can't go into a lot of detail because we want to have the panel, but there are 3 things that I think are useful. The one on the right is the book called Future Forests, Adaptation to Climate Change, and it came out in January by Elsevier. I was the editor. A lot of good people wrote chapters in that, and it's kind of the state of the science on where we are on climate change and forest management. The one on the left, in the upper left, is something that if you're a forester, you may recognize. It's the Silvics of North America. And this was a book that was originally written in the 60s, last updated in the 90s, and now we're doing an update called the Updated Silvics of North America Project. And it's adding in all kinds of stuff, including about 30-some years of research into this book, and each chapter in the book is a different species. So we're adding that, we're adding projections of species range associated with climate change. We're adding all kinds of other really pertinent information that as a manager you need to know now about climate change impacts and how to manage it on a species by species level. So that's an ongoing project. And some more information, I would encourage you to check out the Southeast Climate Hub. We're part of the USDA Forest Service Southern Research Station. Actually, we have the station director for Southern Research Station in the audience tonight. Toril, raise your hand. Toril's here. Toril Whalen Patel. Yeah. Dr. Whalen Patel has been with the station now for several years. I guess almost 3 years? 2 years. All right, 2 years. But is great to work with. If you have a chance, try to seek her out after we're done with the talks, and she'll tell you all the good stuff we're doing. And we're always looking to partner with folks in the Forest Service. So I think with that, I'm good, and we can bring up the panel.
Awesome. If our panelists could please make their way to the stage. Thank you so much, Steve. That was not easy. He just dissected for y'all climate change and its impacts in about 15 minutes. I think you've done that before, Steve.
Maybe once.
Maybe once. Thank you very much for sharing that. I know people probably have lots of questions relating to Steve's presentation. We're going to put a phone number up on the screen. If you have questions, text them to this number. We're going to start off with a panel discussion. Obviously, we really want your questions, so there, it's coming, it's coming. Before we get started, I'm going to have each of you just kind of introduce yourself and who you're with and what you do. We've heard from Steve. Andy, you want to start us off?
Introductions?
Yes.
So I'm Andy Tate. I'm the co-executive director with Lang of EcoForesters and the Forestry director and a registered forester.
My name is Wesley Skeeto. I work for the North Carolina Forest Service. I'm the wildfire mitigation forester, organized out of the central office, but most of my work is in the western half of the state. Also registered forester.
Hi, my name is Amy Tomcho. I am the Senior Forestry Manager for American Forest Foundation's Family Forest Carbon Program, and I work in the Southeast states, from North Carolina down to Florida.
Shio Nagada, Ayan, Tommy Cabe, Dagwa Doha, Shisko Digi Lasan. I say hello, my name is Tommy Cabe and I'm from Birdtown. I've been working for my tribe, my people a lifetime, and I have been employed with my tribe's Department of Natural Resources since 2000, and I also serve as a forest resource specialist. I've done a lot of jobs in our department as we are growing, and currently I also share an interpersonnel agreement with the U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station scheme. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for being here. We have a diverse set of professionals here that hopefully are going to help the audience better understand a lot of the concepts that Steve set up for us tonight and what they look like in practice. I'm going to start off with Andy. Most conversations around forestry as it relates to climate change usually center around carbon storage. Andy, you and I have talked a lot about the need for forests to adapt to and mitigate climate change. Could you share what that looks like from a management perspective and the risks to managing for just one value like carbon storage?
Yeah, that's the big question. So managing forests, I like to think of it as resilience, and the new term we're talking about is actually forest stewardship and even forest carbon stewardship. So to manage a forest to get as much carbon per acre, that's been pretty well researched. We can do, a pine plantation, plant them as close together as possible so they can still grow and get as much carbon per acre. People are even talking about planting non-native trees that grow even faster, or using genetically engineered trees that again grow even faster and store more carbon. So we know how to specifically hone in on one value of a forest. But as Steve explained so well, carbon smart forestry looks at all things and making sure we're stewarding this forest carbon well and have resilient carbon that's going to be there in 100 years once the impacts of climate change have happened. So we're looking at things that is beyond just looking at carbon, but as one of the many values of forests, whether it's wood products, which are a really important part of mitigating climate change because wood is the only sustainable, renewable, natural resource building material we have. Carbon and steel are much more carbon intensive, so if we can use more wood instead of using carbon and steel, we can actually mitigate climate mitigation through using sustainable forests that are reproducing and regrowing and having more wood products coming out of them. But that has to be balanced also. Forests are very important for wildlife, for water, for recreation. Just look around here, the beauty that's probably the golden egg around here, the goose laid the golden egg is the beautiful forests around here have so much value for recreation, and the tourism dollars a lot of that's based on that. So we have to balance those things. So we're looking at managing forests that can be resilient and will still be storing the carbon in 100 years. It might not be storing quite as much carbon per acre if we just focused on that, but that carbon's going to be here, it's going to be resilient, we're going to steward that carbon well and look at forests that maybe aren't so dense, that are really good for wildlife as well, have other co-benefits that we can get out of it. And that's a really important part of what ecological forestry is. Steve called it conservation forestry, and now climate smart has become part of that whole ecological conservation forestry. So we're looking at managing for things like around here it's oak and some of the yellow pine, shortleaf pine that we know are fire tolerant, are drought tolerant. These are things that we know are going to become more common with climate change. So we're managing for a forest that's also more adapted to climate change. It might not store quite as much carbon per acre, but I'm pretty sure that carbon is going to be there in 100 years. And it's also going to benefit water and wildlife and be a great looking forest. That's a really important impactive thing. So it's looking at all values of forest and balancing them and making sure that we're having carbon in our forest, but also stewarding the forest well, stewarding the carbon well, so we have a resilient forest, we have resilient carbon in our forest as well.
Thank you, Andy. Amy, the American Forest Foundation is actively engaged in helping landowners manage for carbon as well as other values. Tell us about the Family Forest Carbon Program.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Lan. I want to just start by backing up just a second and talk about how very exciting it is that we have the carbon markets emerging now. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, actually it is not an either or, it's an and, in my opinion, with the carbon management. The foresters who are doing good work, they are increasing the carbon storage and sequestration naturally. This is what carbon forests do, right? And it's just particularly exciting for me, having been in a diversity of roles in my career and always wishing that I could pay landowners that I'm working with for stewarding their forest. Payment for ecosystem services. The carbon market is a mechanism to do that, and it's very, very exciting. And so what the Family Forest Carbon Program does is, together with the Nature Conservancy, works with private landowners to basically instill good forest management. It pays for the management done in the forest. And the place where carbon comes in, there's a couple of places, but one is we are able to leverage the funding from the sale of the offset credits to pay for good forest management. This is opening a lot of doors for landowners who previously could not, good forest management is a luxury to them. What they had was land and trees, and they were doing all they could just to keep it. Programs like the Family Forest Carbon Program, bring a little more equity into that forest management. That's a very exciting piece. Another thing that's particularly exciting about the Family Forest Carbon Program, and we can go into details about, additionality and that sort of thing. But the Family Forest Carbon Program is it's like a gateway for us to have a mechanism to continue to have these conversations that monetize ecosystem services in a way that we have not been able to do before. And so we're already talking about a biodiversity credit, we're talking about stacking credits, and there's a lot of science that goes behind it to make sure that it's an additional value rather than just, business as usual. But I see it as a very, very exciting thing. And so the Family Forest Carbon Program is coming to North Carolina this year. So happy to tell you more about that after the panel.
That's great. Thank you for touching on. So we'll talk about this a little later, but the majority of forests in Western North Carolina are privately owned, about 70%. There's a lot of development pressure, particularly in this area. And so incentivizing forest management and helping getting resources to landowners is a big part of climate smart forestry. Tommy, the Eastern Band has always managed their land very intentionally.
We used to.
Still do. How do you account for carbon in your forest management planning?
Well, first of all, let me give you all a geographic photo of our landscape currently. As you all know, we used to own hundreds of miles in the southeast, everything from approximately around Hickory, west to North Carolina, southwestern Virginia's, southeastern Kentucky, and everywhere from Nashville, Tennessee, east, down into probably the southern reaches of maybe as far down as Tuscaloosa, down into Creek. That's why we fought with the Creek, and flirting with around Canton, Georgia. So currently, we have 56,000 acres called the Qualla Boundary. And of those 56,000 acres, we have 5,500 acres of common lands for each enrolled member for the Eastern Band Cherokee Indians. And we have approximately 16,000 to 17,000 enrolled members. So that leaves about 50,000 left in the possessory holding landscape. And possessory holding landscape is unlike state holding landscape. Each tribe across the country has a different land title tag. Ours is possessory holding. That means that my family's land on the Qualla Boundary is in our possession until we pass. And if we have generations to pass that land to, then they get it. If our bloodline runs out, it goes back to the tribe. So when I want to harvest and practice forest relations on my property, I have to pay a stumpage fee back into the greater good of the land, as some of you all might know what the stumpage fees are. Essentially, it's a percentage of any kind of rough sale that goes back to general forest management or forest relations. So we wanted to look at carbon sequestration with some of back in 2018 or 17, and we got invited to a carbon sequestration event in Boone, and me and my new department secretary, my manager, went to this event, and we started talking. We got right straight down to business and was wanting to explore it because our possessory holding is capped at how they can use their land. And basically the guy said, well, you might have to relinquish your sovereign immunity. And I basically stood up and said, this conversation's in, it's mute, I don't want to even go there. There's no way in hell we'll ever do that. And I walked out. And so we're keeping an eye on it. We're keeping an eye on how that can actually be beneficial to us as Indian country. And that's about where we're at with it. You know, we don't really have a projection in place. We're just, you know, keeping kind of loose ends with what that could look like for our possessory holding in our landscape. So.
Thank you. Wes, you were out on a burn today, I think. It's that time of year for those of you who see smoke on the ground, and smoke in the sky. It's usually because people are doing controlled burning. Burning releases carbon, but it also has many positive benefits as well. Where does fire fit into the carbon conversation?
Everybody's familiar with the term good, cheap, and fast, right? It's never going to be all three. So we have ways of managing the forest that'll control wildfire risk. You know, when you have mastication get out there, that's not really doing a lot for carbon, and it's not really doing a lot for all these other ecological values. We talk about water usage, more increased drought. You have your poplars and your red maples are climbing up the hill, getting out of places that they used to be. We're trying to, use prescribed fire to have a montane oak hickory, shortleaf pine, a lot of these yellow pines we've talked about. Those use a lot less water. So it's really using prescribed fire. Not only is it the most efficient, but you're going to pick up a lot of those other benefits with that as well. Okay. Prescribed fire on the landscape, it's really come on. A lot of nonprofits are getting in the game. Consultants really building the base for prescribed fire being on the landscape. Prescribed fire associations, PBAs. Got 2 new ones in the western part of the state. Repping one of them on the hat here, and the other one is a Piedmont PBA. Kind of encompasses the area north of Charlotte over there, kind of the southern Piedmont. But yeah, between the feds, state, we're all doing more to get more fire out on the landscape for all those ecological reasons, for all those hazard reduction reasons. So it's really good to see the concerted push starting to show some benefits now.
Great. So the flip side of controlled fire is wildfire. Fire is a pretty hot topic as it related to climate change. Sorry. Steve, can you share what we should expect in terms of wildfire frequency, severity, and location?
More. Yeah, that's, there was a paper that was written probably about 20 years ago now, a guy by the name of Peter Easterling. And it was a science paper. So in science, there's different grades of paper, journals. So like the top of the tier, the best, are the journals Nature and Science, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. Those are like the best of the best. And then there's journals that kind of go on down till you get to, Bob's journal from his garage. But about 20 years ago, there was a paper that came out by Easterling on wildfire. And he published it in Science, which is good as it gets. And basically his conclusion was when it gets hotter and drier, there are going to be more fires. So, that's the way science works sometimes. You have to state the obvious and then prove it. And so he proved it, and it made it into a science paper. But what we're seeing in all cases, I showed that one graph, the 10 hottest years have been the 10 last years. Now, it's not universal, right? There are parts of Georgia historically and Alabama have actually been cooler than historically they are now. So it changes. But overall, we are getting hotter and drier. And when you couple that with a Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service policy for many decades of put it out. We used to have a policy, I showed my great Uncle Bill up there. Back in his day, the objective was get the fire out before the sun goes down. That was our objective. And in the short term, that seemed like a pretty good idea. You would keep the fire from spreading, you would reduce loss of property and possible human loss. But in the long term, we built up this fuel, and now we have wildfire fuels all over the West. And when you couple that with it becoming progressively warmer and drier and more extreme, not on average, but extreme heat. You know, Texas, you may have seen this in the news just last month, they had the most fire they've ever seen in the history of Texas. Texas has been around for a while. And it's not just a combination of climate change, but it's management. And so now we're trying to back our way out of that in a way that's not going to get out of control, get to these mega fires. But by and large, regardless of what we do, we're going to see more wildfires. And they're going to be larger, and they're going to be starting earlier and going later. But through proper management, through thinning, species selection, controlled burning, all of that helps us to reduce that. So we're adapting. You know, we can't eliminate it, but we're adapting.
So Wes, wildfire and controlled fire, I think gets conflated in the public's mind sometime. How do you and others assure that controlled fires stay controlled?
Well, to defend John Q. Public just for a second, professionals, when we say managed wildfires, unstaffed wildfires, wildfire for resource benefit, I mean, there's so much terminology that, you know, new terms pop up and then we move away from them. So as we have to be deliberate with our language, first of all, not to, you know, take somebody that doesn't really know quite what you're talking about anyway and mix it up. But in terms of contingency planning, you know, we do write a prescribed burn plan for every burn that we do. The U.S. Forest Service, other federal agencies, there are 21 element plans. You know, anytime you get a federal agency involved, our burn plans are, I think they're 6 pages, front and back. They got volumes. So the level of contingency planning that you do it varies who you work for. Landowners can have a front and back, but they've got adjoining landowners considered. They've got smoke-sensitive areas considered. They've dialed all these things out, having very specific wind parameters, very specific environmental conditions, fuel conditions. You know, what is the fire going to do? Are we going to accomplish the different objectives that we've set out? You know, people ask about the difference in controlled burn and prescribed burn. Controlled burn has been around longer, certainly, but think of a farmer, if he burns his field off and it doesn't get out of where he intended it to be, that was a controlled burn. If somebody burns a pile in their yard and it doesn't go where they didn't want it to do and it burns all up, that's a controlled burn. All these other elements, you know, when you start saying we can only have west or northwest wind, and we're waiting for that. We're waiting for a specific days since rain. We're waiting for a specific maximum, you know, wind speed, a minimum RH that we're looking for, where you're going to really accomplish the things you're going to do. There's a lot of thought that goes into it, and the burn bosses that boss these burns, you know, are very experienced folks. So,
Tommy, the Eastern Band is no stranger to using fire. What can you share with us about the indigenous culture and your relationship with fire?
Well, fires are relative. It's an earth element that's our relative. We have a relationship with fire. We have always had a relationship with fire. Actually, fire suppression in our culture was an act of discrimination because you took fire away from the landscape, took us away from the landscape, so actually you took away that relationship. And so what we're working on now is we're working on defining the difference between a cultural burn and a prescribed burn. I mean, think about the words. When you go get sick, you go get a prescription, something that's going to make you better. It's a prescription. It's a prescription. A cultural burn has intent, it has a methodology. It's millennial relationships with this landscape. There's an objective. And so the same kind of framework is actually there for the control burn, but there's more of a relationship establishment there. And so what we're doing in the Southeast with some of our Southeastern tribal relatives is that we want to create a cultural exchange to where Southeastern tribes create these modules and they get deployed from the Creek, from the Choctaw, from the Miccosukee, Seminole, Eastern Band, Catawba, all in the Southeast to learn this cultural exchange network and what it means to these different forest types. And again, we don't have the word forest in our language because it severs our relationship with our non-human relatives. I would ask that you all pay attention to what's going on in California with the California tribes, the Mono Ranchera tribe in Southern California, the Pomo tribe, the Karuk tribe, the Hoopa tribe. All these tribes have created coalitions to explain the difference between cultural burns, prescribed burns, and control burns. A cultural burn, like I said, is an act that's been done on this landscape for millennia. And what these cultural burns are reflecting is an increase in water quality, an increase in water quantity, and overall good ecological habitat. And so CAL FIRE actually supports the cultural burn. And so where we're at in the Southeast is we're having to do these cultural exchanges with our federal partners by our oral histories related to land to justify doing a cultural burn. And we just did a cultural burn last week and on my family's property in Birdtown to correlate the relationship between fire and white oak trees for basket making. And so we've been monitoring this for about 4 years now. We had a tree extracted before burn. It was a good tree. We had a tree extracted this past winter, 3 years after we burn it, and a basket maker was very skeptical about fire and the quality of basket splits for that tree is going to produce. I seen him today at the Speakers Consortium, and I said, "Hey, Charlie, how's that tree turn out for you?" He said, "It's awesome." I said, "Hey, man, that thing was in a burn zone," and he was just like digging it. So we're in this paradigm, we're in this shift, and so across the United States and up into Alaska and Canada, you know, in Indian country, you're witnessing a renaissance to where federal agencies are becoming more intimate with indigenous communities to learn these values of the landscape and land. What you call management, we call relations. So.
I've heard the word intentionality several times already, and I think that's really getting to the heart of what we need to be thinking about in terms of how we manage our forests. I mean, being intentional means thinking beyond what you're doing right now, and I hear that a lot when you talk, Tommy. Andy, EcoForesters recommends fire in just about every plan that we write, but it's not that simple. What are some barriers that the private landowners putting controlled fire on the ground?
Yeah, so fire is a really good thing that benefits. I mentioned oak and yellow pine, shortleaf pine, and pitch pine, that these are actually fire-adapted species that benefit from fire, and these are really trees that are well adapted for climate change too. So it is something we recommend if you have a drier forest type that would have historically naturally burned or been burned for, as Tommy said, for thousands of years. The Cherokee were burning the landscape regularly. That's why we have so many oaks, so many yellow pines around here, and now they're declining. So, but we recommend burning, but for the past 100 years we haven't had burning, and the number one reason why is just it's a natural human fear. People are very rightfully afraid of fire and smoke. You know, it's not something you want to be around. But when you look at the bigger picture, it's a really good thing. But even when someone then wants to do a prescribed burn, they've gotten past the fear, and there's potential liability there, and there's always liability concerns, and that leads to insurance and money. But it's also just the logistical. It's very hard to get it done. There's very people that do it because it is, again, liability-wise, insurance, and just having someone who's going to take that liability on. And then the logistics, you have to have very particular weather, as Wesley was talking about. It can't be too hot, can't be too cold, can't be too dry, can't be too moist, can't be too windy. There's a very little Goldilocks window for when you can do a prescribed burn, and you can manage it well and keep it under control and have the desired effect, so it's a mild understory burn and doesn't get out of control and cause mortality to larger trees that you don't want to get harmed that way. So it's a big challenge to get through, and there just aren't people that do it also.
Yep. Thank you. I'm going to try to keep us moving. That we've got the audience questions that are coming in as well. I'm going to paraphrase something that Andrea Combs said. Steve, you referenced the Yale presentations on climate smart forestry, and she was one of the presenters. It's important to ask the right questions. Of course, a forest left alone will hold more carbon, but only if there are no people on the planet. But there are over 8 billion people on the planet, and we interact with forests in a number of ways. How much forest land should be managed and how much should be left alone, and how do we change our management to support the most positive range of outcomes? I think that gets to the heart of what we're trying to figure out now in terms of what we manage and how much should we manage. I referenced the 70% of private landowners that are in Western North Carolina who are forest landowners. These are the ones who have to maintain that forest, who have their values that they're trying to represent in their forest. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Steve, you referenced trade-offs in your presentation. Could you share a little bit about what no-regret scenarios mean?
Sure. No-regret scenarios are different depending on who you are. Everybody has their own values, cultural values, social values, different values. So what might be a no-regret scenario for one person isn't for another. Some person may decide to, dye their hair fluorescent orange. No regrets. Some people may do that and then maybe think, maybe that wasn't the best idea for me at the time. Same with forestry, right? There is no single no-regret option. There are things that we think from a climate change standpoint would be better ideas than others. For example, it's been mentioned here, shortleaf pine, oaks, hickories. These are all species which are more drought tolerant, fire tolerant, tolerant of the kinds of conditions that we expect to have under climate change. So as you're managing your forests, as you're regenerating your forests, trying to encourage some of these more tolerant species is by general consensus, would be considered a no regret scenario. Because even if climate change doesn't occur, you're still having these very valuable species on your landscape. And particularly those that have not just a productivity standpoint, ones that make timber or pulpwood or whatever, but ones that have multiple uses. Ecosystem services. Tommy mentioned water resources, quantity and quality of water, biodiversity, wildlife resources. There's all kinds of recreation. Species that give you the most variability and opportunities to have all of that are the ones that are probably the least likely to be regretful in their management.
So Amy, I'm going to lean on your previous experience. For those of you who don't know Amy, before going with the American Forest Foundation, also worked for the Audubon Society. She is a person of many talents. I was hoping that you could share a little bit about managing for wildlife, maybe using the golden wing warbler as an example and thinking about what managing for wildlife does in terms of trade-offs for landowners.
Yeah, thanks for that question. For those of you who don't know, the Audubon Society and this land trust here and EcoForesters was involved in a habitat restoration project with golden wing warblers that successfully recruited at least 2 new birds, and this is a big deal because their population is declining precipitously. Yay, fist bump in the back. But the golden wing warbler is a bird that likes both early successional habitat and mature forest. And I think that's a good example to highlight what Andy mentioned earlier, and that is climate smart forestry involves making the most resilient forest you can with management. And part of that is a diversification of age classes. And so when we look at wildlife, we know wildlife, likes shelter. But sometimes we don't think about the early successional forest as, climate smart, but they are in a variety of ways. One is species preservation of all sorts, not just birds. But also you're introducing a new age class in that stand, which will be the next mature forest. And while doing it very conscientiously, golden wing warblers like 20 to 40% canopy retention. So there is a way to stack these benefits, just like with the carbon markets, and it's the professionals like EcoForesters that can help you balance all of those objectives.
Thank you for that shameless plug. Tommy, speaking of wildlife, we know that elk are coming back and we're seeing them more and more in Cherokee. What are some of the top priorities for your elders and your possessory holders in Cherokee?
For wildlife?
For anything, yeah.
Well, since I don't want to go down a lot of rabbit holes, it's kind of a big question,
Okay.
So yeah, the elk were, they weren't. Is it still okay? Is that I got to talk into it just right? So, first of all, we had elk, we had a wood bison, we had a cougar, we had a wild parrot. Those things are gone for a reason, and that reason is because this land was decimated. I mean, no pun intended, but it's decimated by y'all's ancestors. And we're in a position now to where we're still getting stepped on as an indigenous community because the Park Service basically didn't do any consultation with us, and they just threw elk in their park. And so we've had to adjust and adapt to, they're awesome creatures, they're delicious, they're getting people's gardens, people crash into them, and I think the latest count we had was like 250. So we're struggling with what's the value of these wildlife? Well, from a economic standpoint, some of the guys say that, they're worth $1 million a year on hoof and alive. But that's hard to explain when you have a cultural garden that's been fed cultural seeds, and there's this relationship with land, and you got this animal who is not here for a reason, comes through and tears the garden down. So this disrupting this relation. And so there needs to be more time for true consultation with tribes and indigenous communities. Really sincere consultation. Don't just come through our community and spend a little time and think you're the latest expert. There needs to be direct, purposeful consultation for these types of things to consider for our next generations. And we don't like to just think and plan for our generations as far as next generations. We like to plan for the generations 100 years out. We have a 7-generation rule. So that means to leave this environment, this world, in the pristine manner, which it's not really pristine right now, for 7 generations after you die. And so that's a big undertaking, and we would like for people to be sincere and to be devoted and committed when they come and they want to, they want to consult with us. They want they want to seek this relationship. I was at the Speakers Consortium today, and I can tell you we're willing, but don't step on us either. So at the same time, we are there we're still here for a reason. And we have a lot of historical, traditional ecological knowledge I'm sure we would like to share if it's going to be shared in an appropriate manner. So that's a broad question. So
No.
I took an opportunity to be direct. Sorry.
Yep, nope. Tommy's a good friend of mine. He tells it like it is, and that's why he's here tonight and why we appreciate you sharing with us, man. We really do. Andy, I'm going to get you to finish this question up with, to help the audience understand how we help landowners manage for some of these trade-offs that we've been talking about in regards to forest management.
Yeah, so the number one thing is landowners, whether it's a government agency or a small private landowner, is we're trying to help them manage for their goals, whatever they are, and do so in a way that, again, tries to balance all these things and creates, we're looking again for resilient forests and doing ecological management, which takes into account all the values of the forest. And someone wants to do a timber sale, we can do that. And we can do that in a way that's got a win-win scenario. Like Amy mentioned, we did a timber harvest. They wanted to create habitat for this golden-winged warbler, this endangered bird, and they had to actually cut down trees and open the forest up more so it was appropriate habitat for it. And they said, well, if we're gonna cut these trees down for the bird habitat, maybe we can sell these trees, support a local logger, get the timber to a mill, produce good, sustainable wood products. And it was, again, a win-win there where it benefited the wildlife, and it actually wound up being a good timber sale as well for economic purposes. And the land trust got some money out of it so they could then reinvest in the forest and hoping to expand that project and also control their invasive species. So funding is a huge thing, and anything you can do to make the funding help out is a big deal. And that can be timber, but that's also, a lot of our clients don't want to harvest timber. Their primary goal is wildlife. You can manage for wildlife, and there's cost share you can get through federal agencies that can help out with that. If you have a forestry plan that calls for the actions and has well laid out steps as to how you're going to get there. So there's lots of things coming up there to help people meet their goals, but also lay out the trade-offs on things. There can be some trade-offs if you're going to do it out there. And if you want, whatever you want to manage for, make sure it's at least a situation, not a win-win, it's at least a win and a tie. You're not, having any deleterious effects on the forest out there, because all the values are important. And, if it's done well, sustainable forest, then the forest will come back. And that's the bottom line and kind of the underlying assumption that all foresters work under, is that you have to do sustainable forestry. Whatever you're doing for the forest, stewarding it, it's going to come back at least as good as it was before, and hopefully better is the plan. And it's a long-term thing. You do forestry for your kids. As Tommy said, even 7 generations out, it really is. It's a long-term investment you have to go through there. And those are the goals you got to think about and lay out. Oh, what are you going to do? You know, a forest plan is a 10-year plan, but you really need to think even beyond that for things.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to get to some audience questions. We've got a lot that are coming in. A softball to get us started. Everyone's favorite tree species on the panel.
White oak.
White oak, Andy, Steve?
Picea rubens, red spruce. That's what I did my dissertation on.
A red spruce, okay.
You don't see a lot of them up here. And he took my whiskey one. That's always the first one to go off the board. But because the genus and species is so fun to say, sweet gum, liquid ambar, styraca fluid.
Wait, you like sweet gum?
Oh,
My favorite tree is bald cypress.
Yeah, I don't pick favorites. If I had to, if I had to, well, unfortunately, it's not here anymore, but it's the American chestnut.
Yeah. Well, that's a great, thank you for that segue, because another question we have, many of you know about we've lost a lot of ash trees, as well as the hemlock trees are also suffering as well. We have a question about what should you replace the ash trees with, is one of the questions. And is there a viable and responsible alternative to hemlock for our stream banks as the hemlock goes the way of the chestnut? 2 questions in there.
Who wants to take this?
Anybody?
Yeah, it doesn't have to. Somebody see Margot in the back there. Yeah, a lot of treatment going on public lands for hemlock. The job I took when I first joined the North Carolina Forest Service up at DuPont, Eric Folk got started doing a lot of that back in 2007, I think. So there's a lot of good examples to look at there, but it's a yard tree treatment. It's not the bugs are coming, the beetles, but that's in the works, showing, and is it going to be too late? Maybe for some of those smaller ones coming back up, we'll get started again once that pressure equalizes. But yeah, Bud Mayfield is another good one to talk to. Anybody else?
Behave yourself, Faye. I see you back there. I see you back there.
There's call share programs too out there for those less enthusiastic.
And who Wes referenced, Margot with the Hemlock Restoration Initiative is in the back. Any hemlock owner, she's raising her hand back there. She would be happy to speak with anyone about hemlocks afterwards. There was another sticking with species, let's see, with the future range of trees generally shifting northward, are there species that we should be favoring that are not currently dominant in our landscape?
Yes. If you've ever gone to a website, or you haven't gone to a website, check out something called the Climate Atlas. Just Google it, maybe Forest Climate Atlas. It's a great site. It's a Forest Service site in the Northern Research Station, and it's been the life work of a couple of foresters, and it's still being developed. But basically what it looks at is it looks at species adaptability and survivability under climate change. And what's nice about this particular site is that it tells you how confident we are about where certain species will be in 50 years, 100 years from now. And yes, it's called Climate Atlas or Tree Atlas. Tree Atlas. We'll get you there, or Climate Atlas. And it's a great site. You can look at your favorite species and be happy or sad about where it's moving to. But generally, as we think about what's happening in the southeast, it's going to get warmer and drier. There's whole lectures to go into this, but one of the big things that's going to happen is there's something called the Bermuda High. And the Bermuda High normally sits around Bermuda in the summer. And what's happening with climate change because of the way the wind patterns are shifting is this Bermuda High is moving further westward. And so we're getting these domes of high pressure that just sit in the southeast, in Georgia and North Carolina for week after week after week. And if you think back, you guys are probably can think about times each summer when this happens. And these are becoming more and more frequent. So what that means is that it's stressing our trees. And so trees that are more drought tolerant, trees which are more fire tolerant are the ones that are going to do better. And those are the hickories, the ash, the shortleaf pines. As it gets even warmer, we'll probably see things like loblolly pine become more prevalent, and other species we've never seen up here, or rarely. They'll grow, but normally they break up. But anyhow, we'll see more of these species that we haven't traditionally seen in this area coming into the area. And that's part of the challenge, is that climate is changing more rapidly than the species can migrate. So they need assisted migration if we're going to maintain some of this functionality. We can't maintain all the species. It's just not practical. My favorite species is Picea rubens, red spruce. Chances of it being still here, and it hurts me to say it, by the end of this century is very low. But it's what all the science tells us. So what replaces red spruce? Can something replace it? If not by a species, then functionally in an ecosystem. That's what, as ecologists, we need to think about now. Where do we save the species? It's triage. What species can we save? And if we can't save them, how can we save what they do with another species?
Thank you, Steve. That's a great answer. There's so many questions that we're not going to be able to get to. I want to give everybody the opportunity when we're done to have a chance to speak with the panelists. We've got questions for Tommy, for Amy. Find them afterwards and please ask them. I want to end on this question. What would Western North Carolina forests look like in 100 years if climate-smart forestry principles are adopted, and what would it look like if they're not?
You don't want to know my answer. I just talked. I'll let Andy talk.
I can give at least a partial answer to that. We don't know exactly, but if we do nothing, we know it's happening. If we do nothing, we know it's not going to be good. So we have to do something. And what we're doing, again, with the best science available, which people like Steve are providing with us here, the best we can, we're still going to have to do adaptive management. Just looking at what's going to be the most resilient thing as best as we know, and then re-examine every 5-10 years to see if we have to adjust course as we see things unfold. But if we don't do anything, we know it's not going to be good. So we have to take some steps. We've talked about implementing these climate-smart forestry practices to make a more resilient forest that's better adapted to climate change, and also the forest can play a big role in mitigating climate change if they're managed well by storing that carbon in there. And programs like Amy have there are actually paying landowners to do that management. So we have both those things we have to do: prepare the forests and also make sure they're being used well to help mitigate climate change and store carbon and store it well, resilient carbon storage.
I'm going to take a little bit bigger perspective. What I think will happen is we will have land converted to development and homes and that sort of thing, because part of the conundrum is the way that we value our forest, and the fact that we are a society that is dependent on economics. And the better we can do increasing the value of our forests on all levels, and I know everybody in the room agrees with me there, but we need to continue to take that message out. And we can't just hope that it's going to make a difference. We have to take the actions that will lead at that course. And it's taking chances in some ways, right? But the good forest management comes in if we have the forest to manage. And I think anything we can do to keep the value of the forest, particularly, financially, talking about markets and that sort of thing, is going to be helpful as we look forward to the next 30, 100 years.
The tribal elder told me that Mother Nature bats last. And so in most indigenous cultures, you will find that, yes, we want to, we're active, we're wanting to, share some of our knowledge, but at the same time, we're at peace with our relationship. And so attached to valuing your forest, I think each person needs to value their relationship, assess their valuable things as a human and what that means in having a relationship with land. We were talking about smoke earlier, and people were concerned about smoke. There's all these models about how to predict smoke. The Mono Rancheria tribe in Southern California, they say, stick your nose in that smoke, smell it. You need to know what that smoke smells like. You need to know if that's a leaf fire, if that's a brush fire, if that's a wood fire, if it's somebody burning tires in their backyard. Because that's how the animals teach their babies. It's no difference for us. So learning these elements and creating a relationship with land is critical. It's critical moving forward in the next 100 years as far as having a relationship with the landscape.
I'm going to take an optimistic view and say younger and better managed. We talked about the sequestration Amy mentioned earlier and the hypothetical pine plantation that Andy mentioned earlier. Two basic things for people to understand as you talk to your neighbors and to your family. There's only a certain amount of sunlight to go around. That plant them thick, you're going to have to thin them out. So I think biochar, I think mass timber, another shameless plug I'll throw in there. All these new technologies are going to take it to where we can take these smaller diameter products and work them in, lock them away in a building for a couple of 100 years. Excited to see a lot of that coming on. And the biggest thing, reducing those fuel loads, when the wildfire comes through and it's in that thick pine plantation, you're not going to have live trees left. So if it's not sequestered in mass timber, if it's just on the stump, and it's got to be alive. So when that wildfire passes and it rushes, under that longleaf ecosystem poster that many of us have seen, there's no damage at all. It goes until it hits something and stops. A river, a highway, another prescribed burn unit, and it goes out. So that's resilient. I really like the resiliency aspect of all this, because it's stuff you're doing anyway to keep your trees from getting eat up by bugs, keep your trees from suffering from drought. It's really good to see.
I like ending on a positive note. Thank you, Wes. The subject of climate change can be daunting and depressing. And the last thing we want is people to leave here with a negative view of what's going on in the world, because we have to stay positive. We have to be very intentional in how we engage with nature. I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing with us tonight and hopefully imparting some wisdom on y'all. I want to thank y'all for caring enough to come out on a Thursday night and drink a beer with us and listen to these folks. Tomorrow is Arbor Day in North Carolina. That's a positive you can take home with you. So plant a tree, check in on your existing trees, maybe pull an invasive plant or two, and please reach out to EcoForesters or any of the groups that are here. A lot of great folks here. If you would like to learn more, and we can never be of any help. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. A round of applause for our panelists.